What? It does.
How many circles are there in butterflies?
4,
9 grasshoppers. All done.
Hi, my name is Olivia Hughes. Now that you've seen the trailer to my autobiography on growth as a critical reader, let's go in depth to the main points that I hit on in the movie. Nabokov believes that critical readers make their point and then build upon it. He believes that by examining the whole story before making one specific generalization, the reader is able to stay on track with the story. In my reading journals, it is clear that I wait until reading the whole story until I answer the questions. My reading journals also show how I build upon my responses to the given questions. In the Stopping by the Woods reading journal, my answers showed that I took the time reading the poem before actually coming up with a solid answer. For instance, I described, "The most chilling shift in the poem takes place going into the last stanza. This is developed when Frost writes, 'And miles to go before I sleep.'" Frost, line 18. This line is repeated twice, which proves its importance. This line is seen as scary because the developed mysterious tone of the piece creates question on what nature Frost used the word sleep. The word sleep can mean literally going to bed, but it can also mean death. Without reading the entirety of the poem, I would not have been able to make such a deep statement. In every piece of literature, and certainly this poem, it's important to understand how all of the details of a story work into each other. Without reading the whole story before answering the questions, it's almost impossible to figure out how a story is supposed to be. Even though this first reading journal was filled with details, adding on to other details, my reading journals got better as they progressed. In Of Mice and Men, I wrote, "Killing Lenny was certainly not in George's best interest, but he had to do what he believed would be best for Lenny. Before George pulls the trigger, his once strong and steady hand trembles with fear. This is not like George, showing a break in his true personality." When answering this question, I flashed back to an earlier description in the novel, which proves that I read the whole story before I started piecing the puzzle pieces of the novel together. As Nabokov believes, it's important to understand the entirety of the book before making generalizations. And this is because it's hard to get a story right if you're missing important clues. In The Great Gatsby reading journal, I made sure to clearly show this growth as well. I went so far as to analyze what's inside the novel as well as certain things about the time period of the novel, so that I could fully understand the author's purpose. I showed this in my reading journal when I wrote, "Cars in the 1920s exemplified wealth, especially the very luxurious cars that many of the characters owned. The cars in this novel shadowed the American dream because of how they showed the social class that one is a part of." In this situation, research outside of what the author clearly presented was needed. As discussed in the reading journal, cars paralleled the American dream. I needed a little bit of extra knowledge on cars in the 1920s to be able to make this generalization. The author provided me with all of the information that I needed, but I went more in depth and needed to analyze the time period to be able to come up with a thoughtful idea. There is no shame in allowing even more details towards a piece of literature to build up before making an assumption. I have grown as a critical reader from the first reading journal after the midterm portfolio by truly understanding the point that the author was trying to get across and then expanding on them. Now let's go go more in depth onto the second main point that I made in my movie. can be defined as confused or uncertain. To word this more clearly, Nabokov believes that critical readers need to be a little uncertain when reading literature, that they need to thoroughly enjoy the writing while still staying a little confused. In my most recent reading journals, I showed this aloofness in the comments that I made on the reading journal when discussing with the class. I efficiently used the time given to fill the holes of confusion with comments about the novel. The fact that I didn't totally comprehend the deeper meanings that my peers picked up on shows my aloofness of the reading. Even though I didn't catch every single detail, I thoroughly enjoyed every piece of literature that we read most recently, which basically defines Nabokov's views of a critical reader. In the first reading journal after the midterm portfolio, I made a larger number of comments when discussing than I have ever before. My confusion while interpreting this piece can be shown specifically when I wrote, "The author's tone to this subject is mysterious. Throughout the piece, the narrator's character is not stated. The audience is forced to develop their own assumptions of the narrator. The author writes, 'He will not see me stopping here.'" Frost, line 3. At just the beginning of the poem, the narrator establishes a mysterious personality. The audience is left to ponder why the narrator doesn't want the owner of the woods to see him there. What is the narrator doing that needs to be kept a secret? This statement that I made was extremely repetitive, as if I wasn't exactly sure how to respond to the question. I also use a question which even further shows my confusion towards the piece. It wasn't a very good idea to directly state my confusion, but I do exemplify some of that confusion answered when I look at the comments that I made in the reading journal. As the two novel reading journals come about, I add even more description and length to my comments. In the Of Mice and Men reading journal, I stated, "George has a very small look to him. Steinbeck describes him as small and quick. Even though his height isn't mighty, the rest of his physical characteristics show strength. George has restless eyes, proving he's a hardworking man. Even though at first glance George may seem inferior, he is the truly powerful leader." With this reading journal, I focused on not directly stating my confusion. Instead, I showed what I understood about the novel, expanded on that, and then added to my knowledge by writing down insightful comments that I didn't necessarily think of. In the Great Gatsby reading journal, I really showed my growth through comments. We had a lot of time in class to discuss very deep meanings regarding each question, which really helped me to clearly understand the novel after I read it. Though brief, the comments helped me to show how delighted I was to be able to clearly understand the deeper meanings to the novel. Without the help of my peers, I wouldn't be able to really understand all of the deeply hidden meanings throughout the novel. I have grown as a critical reader because I stayed aloof or uncertain when working through the reading journal questions. Yet through the comments, my greater understanding is shown after I conferred with others. The passion that I had for the novel is also shown through the complexity of my comments because they are written so frequently. It is as if I plan to go back and reread them. You might have noticed a good amount of errors in the comments that were made, but they weren't made to be correct. They were made as quick little write-downs to help me remember things later in the future. Let's examine the last point that I hit on in my movie about how I grew as a critical reader. Perrine believes that a critical reader uses the best interpretation that the author provides. In the Stopping by the Woods on a Snowy Evening reading journal, I made a good example of what a critical reader does not do. I wrote, "The audience gets the feeling that the narrator would rather be all by himself in the freezing cold, rather than being in the village. This is shown when the poet writes, 'But I have promises to keep and miles to go before I sleep.' Frost, lines 17 to 18. The junction 'but' shows the character is hesitant to want to go back. This passage shows how I made a quick generalization and assumed what made the most sense to me, individually, instead of what the text was truly saying. In this reading journal, I took my assumptions even farther and stated, 'The universal truth expressed by Frost here is that isolation creates depressing thought, which in this particular case can lead to suicide. The poet is showing the audience through this poem that indeed the narrator's trip through the woods is brought on by the thought of suicide.' As shown before, the poem does not contain a lot of detail, so I was not following Perrine's idea of a critical reader by making such large assumptions with vague detail. But after being reminded to stand with what the author wrote, I fixed this problem with my other 2 reading journals. While reading Of Mice and Men, I really focused on truly listening to the author and using the most economical interpretation that was provided by the author. It seems as though I was quick to fix my error because I started off the Of Mice and Men reading journal by writing, Steinbeck shows George's higher authority indirectly. He writes, they had walked in a single file down the path, and even in the open one stayed behind the other. Steinbeck, page 2. The author writes this to examine a follow-the-leader situation between the 2 characters. He doesn't state who is leading the other, but when the audience continues to read, it's implied that George is the stronger of the 2. As the page continues, the first man is described as small, quick, sharp, and defined. These adjectives describe a nimble yet powerful man. In this quote, I use the word indirectly, which might seem as though I'm yet again assuming a different interpretation compared to what the novel grounds. But I do strengthen my point by addressing a solid quote from the book right away, and then continue to back up my quote with an efficient interpretation. By using the text to really back up what I believe the author is trying to get across, I am showing growth as a critical reader compared to my first reading journal of the semester. Fitzgerald filled The Great Gatsby with many important hidden meanings, which shows that the reader must be very careful when making their own assumptions. Fortunately, I was careful enough to pay very close attention to the details that the author was trying to get across. I carefully made the interpretation about Daisy's name when I described. Daisy is given her name because of her beauty and perfection. Fitzgerald describes her when he writes, her face was sad and lovely, with bright things in it, bright eyes and a bright, passionate mouth, but there was an excitement in her voice that men who had cared for her found difficult to forget, a singing compulsion. Fitzgerald, page 9. She is described this way to show how her beauty compels men in. This was not a very abstract generalization, which leaves even less room for miscommunication between the author and the audience. This very factual assumption is not abstruse and is thoughtfully backed up with respectful textual evidence. Perrine describes a critical reader as someone who uses the interpretation that the author lays out best. I clearly show this improvement from my first reading journal of the post-midterm to the present. Well, I hope you've enjoyed my outlook on the overview of my autobiography. If you watch the movie, you will see that I've grown as a critical reader because I now linger in the details of a novel before making a generalization. I stay a little aloof while reading masterpieces, and I follow the most economical interpretation that's provided by the author.
Day to you. Happy birthday, dear Olivia. Happy birthday to you.
Oh, very good.